Good afternoon, everyone. I will say a few words in Lithuanian to present this event for audience here at Kaunas bus station, and then we will turn in English for the rest of the time. Labas vakaras visiems, kurie esate šį vakarą Kauno autobusų stotyje. Esu Monika, Kaunas 022, Europos kultūros sostinė. Šį vakarą čia vyks diskusija, kuri yra Ukrainos šiuolaikinio meno trienalės programos dalis. Diskusija vyks anglų kalba, tad kiek laiko būsite čia, kviečiam jūs pasiklausyti, galbūt užduoti klausimų, dalyvauti ir būti šio renginio dalimi. Dėkojam Kauno autobusų stočiai, kuri šiltai mus čia priėmė ir linkime gražaus renginio. Good afternoon once more to everyone. So here we today have the second discussion that is a part of Ukrainian Contemporary Art Triennale, Ukrainian cross-section with the team Ukraine Unmuted this year. So today we have a discussion moderated by Oksana Forostina, and I will give a word for her and our guest today.
Thank you. Thank you again. That's our second discussions, and I will remind again to our online audience and also people here who are listening to us that the part of the fifth biennial triennial of Ukrainian contemporary art. This time in Kaunas. We are very grateful to our Lithuanian partners for having us here, and I encourage everyone to visit the exhibition in Kaunas post office as soon you have a chance. And the special thing about triennial this time is that we also have discussions and the book of essays coming on Ukrainian culture. The idea was from the very beginning to talk about the issue, the issue in question, which is presenting Ukrainian culture to the world from two perspectives. Mostly one is Ukrainian, and the other one from outside, from other countries. And tonight we have Jacek Dehnelis, who's a Polish writer and artist. And translator. His novel Lala is translated to Lithuania. Highly recommended. I think we will mention it several times during our talk. And Jacek lives in Berlin now, and Iaroslava Strikha came from Kiev. She's a literary scholar, had her own course, special course on Ukrainian literature and culture in Harvard University, and she is also a translator, so very welcome, and thank you very much for joining us here in Kaunas. We will talk about empires. Today I realized that if you open a newspaper or a magazine or a website these days, reading the news, sooner or later you are bumping in the term again, imperia, imperial, in the context of war in Ukraine and Russian invasion to Ukraine. But I would encourage our guests tonight to talk broader about empires, not just the legacy of Russian empire, which is of course crucial to our part of the world, both to Poland and to Ukraine and to Lithuania, of course, but also about other empires, and also about this ambivalent legacy we got from them. Not only empire violated our people, our nations, but sometimes our people also used it. So I would invite Iaroslava to talk first about this Ukrainian ambivalent relations with Russian Empire, and first of all of Ukrainian elites, which is a topic of your academic interests, first of all. So you're very welcome.
Thank you so much for inviting me. Thank you for everybody who came. And thank you so much for the excellent questions that does not have any straightforward answers. Because in many ways, we were not just the victims of the empire, we created this monster. Back in the 18th century, Ukrainian territories, the territories that are now Ukraine, were more intellectually developed. They had more universities, they had a more stable intellectual tradition than the parts of the empire that are now Russia. So our intellectuals were complicit in creating this imperial project. Our intellectuals have been complicit in coining the myths that lay at the foundations of this empire. And now sometimes we are grappling for the heritage and legacy of writers and intellectuals with Russia, whom we are trying to reclaim as our own, when in reality they were some of those who created the justifications for this empire. For example, Nikolai Gogol, as he is more commonly known in the Russian version of his name, or Mykola Gogol, is one example of that split identity. Somebody who was born in Ukraine, who was very steeped in Ukrainian culture, someone who probably spoke the language at least to some degree, who chooses to become a member of the imperial central elites. And we can track his progression and his uneasy allegiances through his writing. The most famous example of that is probably Taras Bulba, where we have two editorial versions, one from 1835, which is where the name Ukraine is featured, where Cossacks are described as this anarchic element on the outskirts of the known world, but they fight for themselves. Whereas we have the second, much longer edit from 1842, where suddenly all mentions of Ukraine disappear and are replaced with Russia, even though the period that is being described predates the Pereyaslav agreement, when the Cossack land becomes subjugated to the Tsar. And that final text where Taras Bulba is very much fighting against the Poles and for the sake of the Russian Orthodox faith and the Tsar, is a product of its time, the time post-November uprising of the Poles in the Russian Empire. So we have somebody like that who is working actively for the imperial center against other minorities, who is erasing the specificity of his own group. And we are trying to reclaim that heritage. And then, of course, we have people who just lived in the empire without necessarily contributing actively to its ideological project. But of course, even then, the empire imposes this complicity in this gray zone where no choice is morally neutral. And we have, these people had this dilemma of what do you do? Do you compromise to a certain degree and then you can do some good work? Or do you hold your ground, you don't bend, and then you die in exile without having accomplished anything much? A good example of that is Cyril Methodius' Brotherhood, this cultural, religious, mystical union from mid-19th century, where one historian pens a justification for the special role of the Ukrainian nation. Of course, it's based in a large part on Księgi Narodu Polskiego I Pielgrzymstwa Polskiego by Adam Mickiewicz. It uses the same messianic tropes, but now for Ukrainian culture, where I don't think we are clear about the authorship, but that's probably Kostomarov, where he describes the downfall of all nations who were all created equal, but then they choose tsars and they choose to serve some of their population. And Ukraine, which has never enslaved anyone, becomes this messiah that can offer a model of a just society to other nations. Of course, the Tsarist regime did not take kindly to this message of equality and anti-authority stance, even if there was no radical element that was advocating actual, military fight against the regime. The whole group is arrested. Some people compromise, like Kostomarov, and get off easily and can continue doing good work. Kostomarov, we have the protocols of their interrogations. We know who ratted out whom. We know who behaved like what. So Kostomarov gets off easily, and he's instrumental in creating the vision of how you write about Ukraine, which does not have a state. How do you still write about it as a continuity? You focus on the folk traditions, blah, blah, blah. Some people are less flexible and more moral in the interrogations, and they go down for years of exile. Taras Shevchenko, the national bard, is exiled for like a good part of the decade. He cannot create much during that time. How many more of his poems and his paintings we would have had had he behaved differently? And in other periods, you cannot even say, oh, somebody was moral and was killed, didn't create much, but gave us this moral example, and somebody else was more flexible and survived and did something good. It was very random. If we move on to another empire, namely the Soviet imperial or quasi-imperial project, and look at the outcome of the Stalinist Great Terror in the 1930s, you cannot say that somebody like, for those familiar with Ukrainian literature, somebody like Tychina or Bazhan, these wonderful poets who start out as very experimental, avant-garde, symbolist, and then they survive the Great Terror, they become functionaries in the system, ministers of culture, they become the singers of praise to Stalin. So you cannot say that they compromised and that's why they survived. Many of those people who died were writing denunciations, like Urinets was writing denunciations of other writers, was killed in the same time. And then there were just people trying to live their lives, and that's still a hard position that the writers who worked in Ukrainian have been reflecting on since the 19th century. For example, Lesia Ukrainka, a very canonical, famous writer who's on Ukrainian currency, has this drama set ostensibly in the Roman Empire during the time of the persecution of Christians in the Roman Empire, where she describes a lawyer who is Christian, but he has to hide that fact to make sure that he is seen as unbiased, so he can sometimes protect Christians in court. That's clearly a metaphor of somebody like her family who work in the imperial administration but have to hide their pro-Ukrainian sympathies. And she shows this lawyer who is insisting on his unbiased position lose his children, one of whom becomes acculturated in the majority culture, the other becomes kind of a sacrificial figure. So no matter what you chose in the empire, just not sticking out and doing your thing quietly, or sticking out and paying the price and then not creating much, or like compromising and then contributing to the strengthening of the empire. None of these choices were good, and we have to like reflect on this gray zone, and in many cases we cannot say, oh, this writer should be swept out of the canon because he or she did too much for the preservation of the empire. It requires nuances, and we are just beginning to do that work. Thank you.
Thank you, Iaroslava. I have a temptation to ask more questions for you regarding of what you just said, but maybe later. I have a question for Jacek, and it comes mostly from your novel Lala, which is translated to Lithuania. That's another reason why we are focused on that. And there is this picture from Kiev. You know, Jacek's family has had origins in Kiev in times of actually Russian Empire, when Kiev was a part of Russian Empire. And this picture of these memories of Kiev is very sweet. You know, they are charming in some way. And I think that that's what many of us feel from time to time, that all this imperial imperial excess, imperial greatness, so-called, it's a kind of seducing. I mean aesthetically. And do you have problems with that? I mean, like an inner problem.
Of course, empires have money. Empires can construct things. Empires can afford beautiful buildings like Empire State Building. Empires can bring the railway tracks and build great roads like the Roman Empire, which is like the backbone of the Roman Empire, is the system of roads. So we make use of it. Of course, we are attracted by certain privileges that this money gives to us. It's like with palaces. I mean, like you cannot really have a nation building palaces or a society building palaces without someone's suffering. Palace is a certain form of a living quarters in which basically comes from huge social inequalities. And yet, of course, if we travel to this place or that place and we are tourists, we love to see those beautiful palaces and those great collections of art. And we tend to forget that there is certain pain behind all of that. On the other hand, of course, if you amass money on someone's suffering, you don't necessarily have to spend it on beautiful works of art and palaces and great roads. You can also spend it on golden toilets or whatever. So, it is also a certain decision in those who run the empires whether we should build things for the general benefit this way or another. Of course, it always benefits more the ruling class. Of course, it always benefits more the ethnic majority, not the ethnic minorities, etc., etc., etc. So it's rigged in the very center. However, there is a certain good that or comfort that comes from the power of empires. When it comes to my family in Kiev, I don't think that they perceived it as a sort of Russian imperial city. It would be different if they spoke about Moscow or Petersburg. But in Kiev, I think they sort of felt that this is such an international city. There was a lot of Polish people back then in Kiev in 19th century. It was an important academic center for Polish students. My great-grandfather came to Kiev after he was imprisoned in Siberia for taking part in an uprising against Russians in 1863. And then he spent some time in Siberia, then he graduated, became a professor, and he was a professor in Kiev. So I don't really think that he perceived, or this family perceived, that as a sort of imperial city. However, my great-grandfather was, well, and this is the problem, was he Russian or was he Ukrainian? So in that times, in spite of being from a Cossack family, his name was Karnauchov. And what I heard, it means a cut off ear. So it means that either his ancestors lost ear in a battle or they were thieves because they were cutting off ears of the thieves. So this is some kind of a murky family story, and this is, you know, a man from there. He comes from Cossack family. He is educated. However, his grandfather is a director of a school in Kiev. He personally is a lawyer, so he's a member of the local elites. And I know for a fact that he had his Cossack identity, and that when my grandmother watched a movie in the cinema with her parents, her mother would say, "Look, that your daddies are on the horses, and they are the Cossacks on the horses, and your daddies." So he had this Cossack identity, and at the same time, he would say "Barszcz małorosyjski," little Russian borscht, not Ukrainian borscht, and he would say that, or my Polish family would say that he's Moskal, he's Russian. So this is this thing that we know from many countries, that when an empire comes, an empire that is ethnically different, it partially forces the ethnic minorities into joining by violence of all kinds. But at the same time, there's a certain allure, a certain charm of this magnificent imperial culture that can afford this palace, this villa, this church or sobor or whatever, and somehow it becomes fashionable to be the part of the imperial majority, not the poor peasant minority. We know it from African countries, we know it from United States and Indians of the United States, etc. So this is a very complex thing, because it is easy, of course, to say that those people from minorities who joined the empire are somehow, I don't know, that this is a treason, or that they were stupid. But it is far more complex than that, I think.
I don't let you go. And I would like to share a kind of a personal account for the next question. I spent a month in Vienna this year, and I lived not far from Habsburg and Kunsthistorisches Museum. So that was the area I went to work with my kid, with my daughter, and had some time to reflect. So there is this huge monument of Maria Theresia and these two beautiful museums, and I had to admit that, first of all, I like this, again, I like this greatness aesthetically. So maybe I reveal a bit taste now, but it's beautiful. At the same time, I look at this Maria Theresia monument, and I know that's an important figure for many of my Ukrainian compatriots, especially from Western Ukraine, because that was a good experience for them. I mean, Habsburg Empire helped them to get some kind of political agency and to actually to develop a national project in that. For many reasons, not all of them were sentimental, not all of them was humanistic, but that happened. So Ukrainians mostly have good memories of Habsburg, but there is also Polish part of me, which realized that's the same person, actually destroyed the country, and she was not a humanistic at all. So, and I'm puzzled here. I think that would be a bit easier for a Pole, because you don't have a good empire in your Polish experience.
Oh, we do. Oh, we do, and they are the Austrians, and this is the funny thing, because Poland was partitioned between Austria, Prussia, and Russia, and gradually, with time, with changes of borders, the majority was in Russia, and small parts were in Austria, or smaller parts were in Austria and Prussia, and then Germany. And out of all of that, Franz Joseph, the emperor who lasted for what, 70 years almost, is a figure of sort of our good emperor, like in Schweig's story. This is the good emperor who is peaceful, who takes care of his subjects. Maybe he's not extremely interested in Krakow or Lviv or Drohobych, but at the same time, he knows he has those cities in his empire. He sometimes comes, he waves the hand, a little bit like Pope, a little bit like Elizabeth II. This is this kind of figure. At the same time, of course, the Austrian administration, Austro-Hungarian administration, was extremely efficient in playing this game of different ethnic minorities in Galicia and playing them against each other. Ukrainians against Poles, Poles and Ukrainians against Jews, Czechs against Slovaks, whatever it was. There was a governor called Stadion who said that his main task in Austria is keeping those 16th century, those 16 different ethnic and national groups into constant struggle, so they are fighting themselves and Austria is safe. But yet at the same time there is a huge sentiment towards Austria. Why? Of Franz Joseph, because in comparison to Prussia and especially to Russia, this partition was least aggressive. So they allowed Polish language in the university. You could have some kind of Polish, rather folk than nationalistic, but still some kind of Polish identity, celebrating that. Polish members of the parliament became important politicians. They would be ministers of the Austrian-Hungarian Empire. They would come to the Austrian parliament in their Polish national costumes, like Hungarians, like anyone else. So this was a different tradition than the Russian tradition, especially, which was the tradition of you cannot have anything of that because it's just too dangerous if you speak your language or whatever. So in comparison to that, there is a legend of Austro-Hungarian Empire as the good ones.
I suggest to come back to Kiev with Iaroslava, and we have all actually during maybe 7 or 8 years we've been having these long discussions about decommunization and also decolonizations, and one of the arguments of the opposition to decommunization was okay, but part of architectural legacy monuments in Kiev is in fact imperial. Yeah, like for example St. Andrew's Church, or Mariinsky Palace, or some sightseeing in Kiev will link you to Russian Empire sooner or later. So how can, especially taking into account what you said before about this the story of cooperation between Ukrainian national elites and Russian imperial state system, where is the line? What would be our good approach to that? How can we divide our and imperial?
I don't think there is a good answer. I don't think you can divide it like that. And often the same symbol would have two very different meanings for somebody speaking from the imperial mainstream, the center, and from somebody speaking on the margins. Take, for example, the monument to Bogdan Khmelnytsky. Yes, who was... Cossacks were a very ambiguous figure for Ukrainian intellectuals throughout a significant part of the 19th century. They are ambiguous for Taras Shevchenko. They are, of course, very ambiguous for somebody like more democratic, like Drahomanov. On the other hand, Bogdan Khmelnytsky can be a compromise figure who, on the one hand, is celebrated by the empire because he is the one who brings these lands under the fold of the empire. On the other hand, he has some local specificity. He can have meanings for pro-Ukrainian groups within the city. And it's a hilarious story that lasted through basically the whole latter part of the 19th century, this history of how this monument was erected and discussions around how do you frame that monument. Does this mounted statue on a horse, does it necessarily have to trample the figures of Catholics and Poles, or maybe we can do without that? How do you sign that? And people who are known for their pro-Ukrainian political and cultural sympathies were on board with that project. The historical claws of the statue were created by Antonovich, who is definitely familiar to everybody in the Ukrainian cultural history sphere. On the other hand, it was framed on the plaque as a gift from the united and indivisible Russia to Bogdan Khmelnytsky, so it was a memorial site for the empire. Then, of course, after Ukraine gains independence briefly on the tail end of the First World War, when this socialist but not Soviet state emerges for a brief second, people try to take down that plaque, but keep Bogdan Khmelnytsky as a local memorial site. And Bulgakov, who is also a native of Kyiv, but with very pro-Russian allegiances, describes that moment of resignification in apocalyptic terms. The sky turns red when people try to rethink Khmelnytsky as a Ukrainian figure rather than as an imperial figure. Then, of course, 19th century, what we think of as the quintessential Kyiv look, of course, it was not this mythical, unified, golden past, because the monument battles were there, the architectural battles were there. There were so many buildings trying to emphasize the unity of the empires, these churches in Neo-Byzantine style, Volodymyrsky Sobor, where the frescoes show the key events in Christian, Russian cultural and historical heritage. So yeah, how do you divide something like that? I don't have a good answer. I don't think we will ever get a good answer. Probably more nuanced takes that don't succumb to this uniform imperial myth that glosses over many of the ambiguities. That's a good start.
So I have another difficult question for you about the same. To what extent should we appropriate these things? So, for example, I think this Khmelnytsky monument, which is very well known, the landscape of Kyiv, even to foreign tourists, but I think it's already appropriated actually as Ukrainian. But as for others, other legacy, again, do we need to appropriate everything, or there is something that we should definitely label as imperial?
Well, for one usually, scoffs at the idea of cultural appropriation. Cultural appropriation is usually not seen as a good thing, but we've been spectacularly good at appropriating and using in our favor the image that was produced by the empire and that was used as a weapon against us. Take, for example, the idea of Ukrainians as this simple folk that dances well, sings beautifully, does not have any intellectual, cultural validity on its own. That's, by the way, I think this myth was not originally, an imperialist, orientalist take on Ukrainians. That's probably a product of somebody like Kostomarov, whom I mentioned. Like, how do you write the history of the state if you don't have a state? Well, you turn to folk customs and folk traditions as a justification for, we have always been here, we exist. And it becomes a weapon against us in the Soviet times, in the 1930s, well, starting with the late 1920s, when this earlier cultural decentralization disappears altogether, Stalin comes to power, and you get this very strict cultural hierarchy where high culture is for Russian, and all the other like ethnic minorities, Ukrainian included in the Soviet Union, they are just there as this colorful ethnographic displays. But then fast forward 70 or like 60, if you count from the 1930s, fast forward 60 years, Ukraine regains independence, and people start looking for a foothold for cultural artifacts that are untainted by this, legacy of cooperation and collaboration with the horrible cannibalistic system. And people turn back to this ethnographic symbols as, the untainted golden age legacy, and do wonderful creative things with it in terms of pop culture. Like think of our performances at Eurovision, Go Away, which mixes folk music with electronica, in visual arts, using parts of like folk aesthetics and doing various creative things with it, in literature. So we have been very good at appropriating, reclaiming the slurs used against us, and doing some good things with it. And whether there are things that definitely cannot be reclaimed, well, I would argue justifications of violence shouldn't, justifications of imperial violence is something that you can study from the history of literature perspectives, but you shouldn't put it on a pedestal. You shouldn't glorify it. Like theoretically, one could even reclaim like Bulgakov. I wouldn't do it, but theoretically, people are trying to reclaim Bulgakov as a part of Kiev history. But a lot of his works are basically justifying the erasure and violent erasure, not just cultural erasure, violent destruction and murder of Ukrainians. Gogol with Taras Bulba, which is in its final version very anti-Polish, anti-Ukrainian, anti-Semitic, is another like borderline case where maybe not glorifying it, but approaching it always with a critical eye to these more problematic parts would be probably a good idea.
Okay, I have a temptation to go on Taras Bulba, but I will not. I have a kind of tricky question for Jacek. That would be a question on taste. So correct me if I'm wrong, but if you are completely ignorant on art and culture, but you have some kind of intuitive, and if you are a snob, it's a safe choice to like something either imperial or radically modernist than to like some of this national art, like romantic art, for example, in Polish. And actually Poland has this long tradition of criticizing and even mocking anti-imperial romantic art, literature, paintings, and everything. So, I mean, like Gombrowicz, for example. So, is it just? I realize that it's the whole outline is very shallow, but is it just that this national anti-imperial art is aesthetically challenged?
I think it's more complex in Poland because Poland, on one hand, was a victim of empires, but on the other hand, it was a colonial empire in a way, it might be argued, which Ukrainians know all too well. So when we criticize, let's say, Sienkiewicz, we don't criticize him because he was going against Russia, let's say, because he wasn't that much. He was just referring to the great golden past of Poland, the times when Poland was imperial. And in fact, large parts of his texts are today very problematic if they are read by Ukrainians, for instance. So I think this is what Gombrowicz was fighting with. Then there is this extremely interesting case of W pustyni w puszczy. So this is a story for children about children of a Polish engineer working in Egypt for English. And his children are kidnapped for political reasons. And this is the story of the children. So anyway, those children are kidnapped because there's Mahdi in Egypt, and Mahdi wants to regain independence for Egypt from the English. Staś and Nel, those two kids, are children of a man who comes from Poland, a non-existing country, because his own country is divided between 3 empires, but he's working for the English empire here, and this very bad Mahdi figure of this terrible political leader is a figure of man fighting for the independence of his own country, who is in a very, very similar position to what Poles are in that period. And when you read it today, the discrepancy between, you know, accepting one independence and not accepting the others is striking. So I think this is problematic here, that in Poland, in contrast to really small nations, for instance, which were never imperial, there is this ambivalence between dreaming of independence, but it's very close to dreaming of your own empire. When only Poland regained independence in 1918, they started the Colonial League, and they said, why everyone in Europe has colonies and we don't have colonies? We want colonies. Let's take someone else's colonies. We need colonies. And nothing happened, luckily, out of it, because it was all taken. So luckily, we don't have this kind of colonial past in Africa, for instance. But I think this is, I don't think it's an aesthetic problem. It is a problem of that any grown-up nation, any nation that is ready to question its own history, which is, I think, absolutely crucial for any kind of modern nation that wants to be democratic, respect European values or humanistic values or human rights, then this kind of discourse, this kind of questioning your own literature, your own culture is extremely important. Not that saying that, okay, everything Polish or everything Ukrainian is crap, why aren't we French, or why aren't we, I don't know, British with their great culture? No, I mean, questioning, and this is also what Americans do or French do or English do, questioning those tricky legacies, these tricky legacies of violence towards minorities, of violence towards other countries, of imperial conquests, and of sort of squeezing out the vital juices of other groups for your own benefit. So we have to question that. But I frankly, like, the Polish Romantic literature is not that much questioned by this. It is more, you know, the 19th century, this problematic legacy of dreaming of Poland as an empire that is crucial here. Because Mickiewicz's the tradition of, like you mentioned, similar one in Ukraine, of, oh, we are the poor nation, we are going to be the Christs, and other nations will get better thanks to us. It is silly, it is understandable from the political point of view, from the historical point of view, but it's not hurting anyone. Whereas things that Sienkiewicz did are hurting, and they are problematic. Although at the same time, for instance, he had a lot of compassion for Indians in the United States, because there he recognized that there is something wrong with it, but he didn't have that in Africa. So this is a very complex problem.
Sienkiewicz may be seen, you know, as problematic, but Ukrainians are so used to like being villains in this like mainstream narrative that when the movie version of Ogniem Mieczem came out, it was absolutely celebrated and venerated in Ukraine because yes, we might be the villains, but it's the first time we are seeing ourselves on the big screen in a production that is not, Soviet. So just representation, yay.
No, but this is one thing. But another thing is that Poland was already in this moment after 1989 that large part of the crew was Ukrainian, and it was not only the actors. There were also people working in the production, and it was sort of working together project. Even if we know that there is a certain problem with this prose, this kind of cooperation is again, it is going in the right direction. Okay, we have our problematic literature from the past, but if we do it together, if there is participation, if there is this representation, then it's better. So this is something I liked about this movie, that there was a huge co-production of Poland and Ukraine with lots of Ukrainian actors, and it sort of makes this aggression milder, this problem softer.
Yeah, you cannot strip away all of the Orientalism because it's at the core, but it is definitely a more nuanced portrayal of the whole panorama than Sienkiewicz probably envisioned.
Okay, that will be the next question for both of you. Again, a shallow one, and partly connected to the previous. But do we still need? I mean, at this point, do we still need a revision of the national canon, both Ukrainian and Polish? I mean, at this point, we are already behind the revision of our imperial legacy for many years. But maybe there is something new that was revealed just recently, and that's especially. Maybe Iaroslava, you would answer it from the point of view of academia, because it's the world is quite close to you.
Say it again, from the point of view
of academia. So, do we still need another revision of the national canon?
Yes, we do, because I'll use the metaphor of canon and iconos, like altar with icons, that was first introduced by Marko Pavlishin, this Australian historian of literature of Ukrainian origins, who juxtaposes these two models. On the one hand, you can have literature as a set of icons that are not there to be engaged with critically, they are there to be venerated. And that's what we inherit from the Soviet Union, where the writers are not necessarily there to be, tackled from the post-colonial or feminist or what have you perspective. They are there to provide a model of how to be a good Soviet man or woman. And once Ukraine regains its independence in 1991, people who have not been used to tackling literature critically, they do not begin the discussion of what this canon could look like. They use the same approach of literature there to be venerated and provide models of good citizenship. And they just add more icons without necessarily disposing of the old ones. So you get dissident writers who died for their beliefs and fight for freedom without necessarily any attention to their works. Like, for example, there's this great, fantastic, lovely poet, Vasil Stus, who happened to be a dissident and died in the camps in 1985. And recently, a dossier of his interrogations by the KGB was published, and his lawyer, essentially a prosecutor at that time, was an influential figure in Ukrainian politics, and he tried to get that book banned. And just as a show of, you cannot do that, you cannot silence our history, people began to buy these really, really boring bureaucratic documents about police interrogations. The print run of these police dossiers that is not, good reading, has surpassed, I think, the print runs of his actual poetry collections. So he is not important because he is a great poet, which he is. He is again venerated as this, fighter for freedom. And on the other hand, you can have a canon, which is a more flexible structure based on a public discussion of like, what do we need? How do we see our culture? How do we deal with its less savory, more problematic parts? So I think we need not so much a revision of the canon as we as a nation en masse need to learn to read and approach our legacy critically rather than, as ready-made, easy to consume pictures.
Jacek, I realize that you had several revisions of the canon lately. I mean in Poland. Maybe not of them were good. So maybe you can pick up here.
Well, it's always such a problem with the canon, because when we think about canon, it's mostly the canon in the educational system. Because of course we also have a canon which is not connected directly to the education, like what any person in our society should know. And I know Harry Potter gets there probably for the younger generation. It's an absolute must if you want to understand the context, the cultural contexts of many jokes. And although the school probably would not be happy to have it that that important in the canon. However, I think it is like you can read Harry Potter at school. Maybe not now, but maybe a few years ago. Hard to tell. I don't have kids, so I'm not interested in how it changes. The largest problem is that lots of those books are just boring. And this is the death of literature, when you stuff children with boring literature. And those books are there because someone who is 60 now and who is deciding about that, learned that 50 years ago, and it was put in that structure of lectures by someone who was already 60 back then. This is a transmission of a very old pattern. And I don't mean the great pieces of literature like Hamlet or Antigone or whatever, Bible. I don't mean the great books, the great international books of the world literature that should be in that canon, but books which were popular in 1930s, like books for children from 1930s. And there are, of course, great books like that from old times, like Mumis, like The Children of Bullerbyn or whatever, or Andersen's stories, fairy tales. But there's plenty of very mediocre literature from 1930s, for instance, which children now are fed with at schools. Those books are not important in any way. They are not part of the world literature. They are not showing the great dilemmas of humans on any level. It is just someone in 1930s said, okay, this is a popular book, let's put it in the canon because children are going to read it and enjoy it. And then someone puts it back in 1960s, and then someone puts it back in 2012. And this is totally insane, because there's plenty of this kind of books which are liked by the children now, and it is very slow that they enter this group. And when they will enter that eventually, it will be already after 2 generations, and there will be completely new books. So I think there is a canon in which we learn the basic texts of our world literature, the basic texts of our national literature and history, because it's often mixed. And then there is a large group of texts which should be changed very fast, because their task is not to teach children of anything in particular about our pasts or about culture. It is to make them engaged in reading, to make reading attractive, to show them how books create other worlds and how those worlds can be attractive to you in this terrible, terrible period when you're growing up, which is absolutely the worst period in your life. And literature is a great way of escaping from those problems and dramas into something, outer, which helps you out. And I think that any canon should be very careful about this distinction between those three groups. So I think this is the largest problem in the educational system in Poland. And the other one is, I don't know if you have that in Ukraine. There's this terrible belief that is given to children that any text of literature is like a riddle, that it has one solution, and the teacher says, and he or she says, so what did the poet have in mind when he wrote this poet? And he has the answer to the riddle in his book, and all those 30 kids in the classroom, they are supposed to read the text and find the solution that he has in that book. But this is totally against the idea of literature. Literature, as any art, is an open way of thinking. You can come to many conclusions. But of course, if you have school, and the school wants to give you not only knowledge, but also propaganda, then of course you need texts with one solution, because this is important for passing the propaganda to the next generation.
Okay, school and education is one of the several dimensions of this, imperial legacy, and that's my last questions to both of you. It's a bit personal. Do you feel empire under your skin? Are empires still there, or maybe empires are history already?
I see the appeal of empires because empires are good at projecting the idea that an imperial culture is not political, that it's neutral. It allows you not to ask yourself hard questions. You can read Jane Austen and not ask yourself where the sugar on the table is coming from. Spoilers, slaves, slave labor. This is where the sugar is coming from. But imperial cultures kind of allow you not to think about that. You can enjoy Downton Abbey without thinking about the political background or the class inequality and what have you. Since writers from minority groups, colonized nations are deeply aware that their cultural choice is not the default, they tend to tackle those kind of questions, and you are more aware of this hard things, the need to take a stand. So I see where the appeal is coming from in Ukrainian culture. I think our pervasive love for British literature that is uncritical is our way to, it's not unproblematic. It was a way to escape the cultural influences of one empire, but by embracing another empire, when we could have embraced literatures of various African nations, for example, which would have been more relevant as cultural models for us. It would have made more sense to experience solidarity and to look for dialogue partners there, instead of, in the British literature. So I guess, yes, there are all those. And also with the current situation, when there's this ongoing conversation about what to do with the pervasive presence of Russian culture in the international cultural market, so to speak, Ukrainians who would have probably been more useful discussing Ukrainian culture are forced in the position where we have to talk about Russian culture to show its, chauvinist, imperialist underpinnings, because scholars of Russian literature are not going to do that. They're going to admire their Pushkin without looking at him critically. And we cannot get rid of that function. So even as we try to walk away from one imperial culture, either into the embrace of another imperial culture, or just making our own way, that zombie of the imperial culture drags after us and tries to clack its teeth at our shins.
Well, I think that first of all, we have empire under skin because we recognize it easily. Today we walked together through Kaunas and we've seen this square with St. Michael's Church. And you instantly know that, okay, this is a new part of the city that was, new when it was built. And there's a large church in the middle of the square. It is a garrison church. It was a Russian church put here basically as an imperial symbol of domination. And I instantly recognized that because I come from a country which was occupied for a very long time. You know, you see that in lots of funny little things, like names of food, you know, that for instance, certain kinds of products which are associated with large empires are going to the menus of restaurants, of national restaurants in smaller countries. Yeah, like you have beef stroganoff in Poland everywhere in lots of restaurants. And where did that come from? So I think we being parts of the former empires, living there and knowing all those you know, remains, all those underneath structures, we just have that under our skin because we just know how to recognize that. And people from the metropolis, they're very often, you know, but this is how it is. They're like, yeah, this is how the world looks like. Man, not really. This is how the world looks like when you are the member of the majority, and when your things that you treat for given and obvious are popular, but not the other way around. It's of course the situation of for instance, British people are abroad speaking their own language, and they are often like irritated that someone does not speak very good English. And they're like, yeah, but if the history, you know, went the other way around, perhaps you would have to learn Czech on the British Isles to speak with anyone in Europe, because that would be the international language, or whatever. So, you know, this is this. I think like the ability to recognize the imperial structures is something that we all have. Just because we were born not as the members of the ruling majorities.
I thank you very much. I'm very grateful for your brilliant inputs. I'm very grateful to our hosts here in Kaunas. Kaunas is European Capital of Culture this year, and we have great partners here. And I'm thank you very much for everyone who watched us online, and you don't see it, but if you watch us online, you don't see it, but there are a lot of people here at the bus station who actually disturbed by us. They're doing their own business waiting for a bus. So Jacek Dehnelis came from Poland, Iaroslava Strikha came from Kiev, and that all happened thanks to International Renaissance Foundation. Actually, they brought us here. Thank you again.
Thank you very much.